everyone, welcome to another painting tutorial from Promethean Paints. Today we're going to be painting the Blight Templars from the Warhammer Quest Darkwater set, but as I've mentioned you can use this for any of your sort of Maggotkin, any of your sort of any Nurgle models, any Nurgle warriors, anything really, when you have a nice dark, dirty, grimy effect using different variations of green. So there's three different ways I'm going to cover. The first one is extremely filthy and very quick to do, but with some really great effects. So to start with, all three models, no matter what way we're going to be doing it, are base coated with AK Tenebrous Grey. So I've done a base coat of black first and then gone over that with Tenebrous Grey. From the Citadel range, Corvus Black would be pretty good, but Tenebrous Grey is a really nice dark black, purplish, smoky colour. So any sort of smoky black would be good. It just gives us a different tone underneath everything. And then what we're going to do is hit it with some dry brushing. So first off I'm using AK Gunmetal, which is a sort of bluish dark metal colour, but any dark metals will be fine here. This is just really getting some metallic finish onto the model, and as you can see I'm being pretty liberal with it. We're going to be going back over some of the areas that aren't metallic just to clean those up a bit later, but the idea here is to catch all the edges and add some texture and some potted areas, some just wear and tear via the dry brushing method. I'm using an Artify dry brush, and they're a good range of dry brushes. You can buy a whole set of about 7 from Amazon for a good price compared to some of the other prices, and they last a very long time. These brushes are about 3 years old now. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to put some brighter silver onto the paper. This is AK Natural Steel, but Stormhole Silver. Any brighter silver. Just work some of that old colour off of the dry brush, and then add some of your lighter. And this is where just very lightly I'm just going to add some of this to where I want the brightest points to be. So the head, the top of the shoulder pads, anything that I wanted just to be a bit brighter, which would catch the light. As you can see, I am sort of painting the gloves. I noticed on the box art actually that the gloves aren't metal. On a couple of these they're actually leather, so we go over those again a bit later on. But yeah, this stage is just to capture some light and dark areas, add some contrast. So even if you just pick out the edges here with the silver colour. Just to add a little bit of tone, I grab some brass scorpion, so any sort of brassy, coppery colour, and I just paint the sort of Nurgle symbols, the sort of goldy coins that they have onto their armour. So anything that you want to be brass or gold, this is where you can just add those colours in. So I'm using brass scorpion, but rusty gold or old gold, or if you wanted them gold from the Citadel range, you know, the gold ranges they've got. going to do now is I'm just going to define the edges a bit more. So I'm going to put some of that natural steel, which was our bright steel colour, onto the palette. And basically I'm just going to do some edge highlighting here, and then add some dots and scratch and scrapes onto the model, just to add a little bit more contrast from the dark and the light, define the edges and add some wear and tear onto the model. This part's optional, but it just helps you just define some more shapes, add a bit more character to the model. Okay, now we're going to make him green. So with this we're going to use the shade Athonian Camoshade. You don't need to water this down or anything, straight out of the pot, and it's basically slap a coat over this all over the model as you would any other shade. Just be careful you don't get any pooling or anything, so I'm using just an old brush. Try not to cover any of the gold brass areas that you've done, and just get a layer of this. If you want a more intense green, add another layer and another layer on top. I just add the one, as we're going to be covering this in a lot of dirt and filth. So yeah, I just wanted there to be a hint of green underneath this model, and the rust effects we'll be doing actually makes the green pop a little bit more. It'd be quite surprising. So yeah, just add a little bit of this all over the model as you would do a natural wash if you were doing Null Oil or Agrax Earthshade. Once that's dry, 10 or 15 minutes, the fun part begins, and for this we're going to be using the Dirty Down water-soluble paint. It's tricky to use at first, takes a bit of getting used to, but basically just imagine this as rust in a pot that you're going to be painting onto your model. So the thicker you add it, the darker it's going to be, and the thinner it is, the more orangey it goes. So I wanted to have quite heavy deposits all around the model, blending out to some orangey areas. So it's a bit trial and error when you first start using it, but I tend to add big blobs of this onto the areas I want to be filthy, and then add some water into the little lid, which sort of thins down some residue to sort of wet blend it out of any areas. You can add multiple thin coats of this, you can add it in huge lumps. It does take a little bit of practice to get used to it, so I'd recommend when you first try this, if you've got an old model, old bits, you know, if you're getting Rhino off of eBay for about £5, just anything, an old plastic kit to practice on, to give it a go before you put some of this on your proper model. It is water based, but it does smell, so I would recommend having a window open when you're doing this, and to wash it out in a separate pot of paint so it doesn't contaminate any of your other paints, and just work around adding huge splodges of this all over the model, and you'll notice it will start to dry quite quickly because it's water based, but it does react with water. So once it's drying, you can use the brush with a bit of water on it as almost like an oil to scratch it around and move it around. And then this is a very nice easy way, without doing loads of washes of lots of different colours, which we're going to be doing a little bit later, to get a really good rust deposit look, because this paint, when it dries, it leaves rust colour, it leaves huge deposit areas that you can then go over again with other colours to make it look heavily pitted and full of filth. As I mentioned, this is the stage now where I'm just adding water into the lid. You do have to give this bottle a really good shake. It's got a ball bearing in it. The ball bearing needs to be rattling around, and all I'm doing now is just wet blending it out. So as you can see there on that shoulder pad, it's drying. I'm just wet blending it out so that you get a different kind of effect on it. There is a few tutorials online from Dirty Down themselves how to use it. There's one on their website you can read through, because they've got a rust effect, a moss effect, a verdigris effect. So if you're going to do it, just give those videos a watch from the people that created it. But they even say trial and error with this paint. Sometimes I've had different bottles work in different ways, but it's a very good way of very quickly getting very good rust effects on large scale. If you wanted to do a whole army like this, it wouldn't take very long. To fully dry, I'd say at least half an hour. But you can, as it's drying, you get better and better rust effects as it's going. So as it was drying, I just went back and just painted all the areas that aren't sort of all rusty and dirty with the Tenebrous Grey again, to just get them all back to a standard colour. As you can see, it's gone orange and absolutely filthy after. That was about 20 minutes. Then what I'm going to do is, optional step, but it just adds a little bit more wear and tear. With your natural steel colour, your bright silver, just a little bit of edge highlighting, picking out any areas that you sometimes see if you look at in the real world on rust effects. You'll see that where there's rust, there's some very bright areas underneath it where it's all rotten away. So just add some of that. It also defines some of those edges again, defining some shapes. So just work around the model, adding in some more wear and tear by using the bright silver colour. Right, one final step is going to use some AK fluorescent orange. You could use like Troll Slayer orange, any very bright orange colour, but the fluorescent orange is really good. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a little bit on the brush, and I'm just going to add little dots and splotches of this in areas that were really heavily worn, very heavily rusty, and this just really makes your rust effect pop. Makes it look a little bit sort of Nurgle-y rust, whereas there's a little bit of magic involved, really heavily worn. So this was the first guy that we've done. So this is the really filthiest one. All the other effects that we do, the skin, the leather work, the tree, that's going to be covered off a little bit later on as we move through these other tutorials. So they'll all be marked on the timestamps of where those are to do the leather and the skin, because it's all pretty much the same across all three models, how we do those. But the only difference on each one of these is all the armour effects that we're doing. So once you've done this with the very bright orange, that's this guy finished. And there he is, absolute filth. You can still see actually in the neck area there, it's still drying. So where you really do heavily put it in with a bit of water, it does take quite a while to dry. So next up, once again, we've started from Tenebrous Grey and then dry brushed with gunmetal and the Stormhold Silver. So dark metallic dry brush and a bright metallic. I've done that because I wanted the green to really shine, because we are going to be darkening it down with a lot of weathering. So first off, I'm using the Vallejo True Metallic Metal colours, and the first one is Dusken Green. So all three of these are called Dusken Green. They're just different sort of types. So the first one, Dusken Green Base. Then we have Dusken Green Shade, and then we have Dusken Green Light. I bought these as the pack. You get 4 of the colour. You get the airbrush as well, the airbrush version of it. And these are a really bright, intense green that then we're going to work down. So this first one is the Dusken Green in the base version. It's a really good paint. Now the reason I've done it over the metallics, as I mentioned, is I wanted it to be very bright. I tried this just over black or very dark grey, and it came out a little bit flat and not very bright. But I really wanted the green to stand through, because we are going to be adding rust to this and dirt. It also, where you've got your dark bits and your bright bits, adds some natural contrast over the top of the shade that we're doing a bit later on. So just work around the model. This covers in one coat, and you can use it on the wet palette. These are really good paints. I've used the red as well. They are, if you paint in metallics, they are very, very good. So just work around painting your base coat green. Once you've done that, we then use this Dusken Green Shade. A couple of drops. I've put it in a little pot there, and with the old brush, just work around the model, adding this as you would any other shade. Be careful, don't want it to pool anywhere. Give it 10-15 minutes to dry. And then once it's dry, we then use the dusk and green light, and this is where we're adding back in all of our brightness. So this is an edge highlight, adding scratches and dents and marks and all sorts of stuff with this. Mainly it's an edge highlight and to bring up the bright areas. So I added a little bit of water to this just to make it flow nicely, and it really does glaze and blend over the shade and the dark green really well to add some great lighting effects, leaving dark areas in the recesses that original colour, and then work your brightness up with just a few scratch marks, dots, lines and scrapes. So one handy little hint is, if you don't like all of a sudden that it goes from dark to light, if you add some little dots and scratches between those areas, it helps the eye blend the two together. The final little step is I put some of the natural steel, so your bright silver, and then this is a very small edge highlight, and just used to add a few more scrapes and scratches on the model, especially to pick out some texture around the head and the shoulder pads. Anything you want to paint gold, just do all brass, like we did in the previous one. Brass scorpion, any copper colours, just add those two. You don't need to do any shade. You can do shading on them if you wanted to, like with some Agrax Earthshade or any colours like that. But with this one, I do leave some areas just steel coloured, just to show that they are completely worn through. And now it's filth time. So as you can see, I've gone over and just base coated all the areas that aren't armour back into that Tenebrous Grey. So first off, we're using AK Medium Rust, which is a sort of mid-tone orangey brown colour. And all I've done there is just 1 or 2 drops of paint with double or triple that amount in water. So you're creating a wash. Doesn't matter if you add too much water. You can always add more coats of this to get darker and darker. So all I do here is add this sort of as we were adding the rust effect before, but with this I'm being a little bit more careful, and just adding splodges of this wherever I want. If it starts to pool a little bit irregularly, just wash your brush out and add a little bit more water to it. As you can see, it's nothing clever here. I'm using an old brush, and just adding this in all of those recessed areas wherever you want it to be dirty, dark and rusty, which is pretty much all of the model. So just work yourself around adding this first effect. After leaving it 10 or 15 minutes to dry, the next colour we're going to use is AK Light Rust, which is a much brighter orange colour. With the light rust, we're going to just do exactly the same. So 1 or 2 drops of paint with double, triple that amount in water. So I would say it's at least a 1:5 ratio. Just go around, splodge this, try and get it in the centre areas of where you did your original colours, and in those heavily recessed areas, and where there's little pits in the armour that they've sculpted, add it into those as well, as the rust would sort of collect in those and be a little bit brighter. And again, you need to leave that a good 10-15 minutes to dry. And once it is dry, we're going to do the old trick we did before with the fluorescent paint. So grab your AK fluorescent orange, or if you use like Troll Slayer orange, just your very, very bright orange. And again, add this into those very, very deep recesses, anywhere where you want to be mega, mega rusty looking. Just add a few splodges of this, not too much, don't want it to be overpowering, just subtle enough that you know it's there around any of those areas you want to be heavily worn and torn. Next step, we're going to add a little bit of a verdigris effect around some of those gold areas. Verdigris is very, very light blue in colour. There's usually a bluish green hint to it. I'm using the game effects from Vallejo verdigris, but you can get the same effect from Citadel if you use sort of like a Sotek green and the ice blue, the Behemoth blue I think it's called. Any very, 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 very light blues will give you this effect. So you just put a little bit on your wet palette, water it down again, exactly the same as we were doing our rust effect. So water it down, and then just add a few splodges of this around your metallic, your goldy bronze areas, just to give a different subtleness of wear and tear around those metal areas. You can add as much as this if you want, or you could skip this step, but you know, just add it around the bell and any gold areas. Just a little bit of this verdigris just adds a little bit more character texture to the model. And that's this next style done. So we've got a nice green metallic finish there with again some heavy rust done. Would take a little bit longer to do an army like this, but again it's quite quick to do. So here we're going to cover off how I do the skin on this guy, because he's got his intestines all hanging out. Basically I base coat it all in a Kislev flesh, so a mid-tone skin colour. Just cover everything with a few layers of Kislev flesh. I then just highlight some of the areas on the intestines, the sort of ribbed areas. Just put a little bit of flayed one flesh on those, because we are going to go over these with some washes. But I wanted to just capture an initial highlight first, just to get some colour, subtlety, like contrast changes. So just carefully pick out the sort of bulbing areas with your highlight colour. So now we're going to make it look filth, and for that I'm using the contrast Volupus pink, really intense colour, but we don't need to water this down. So just grab some on the brush and just paint it all over your sort of skin and anything you're doing that's the skin or the guts hanging out, anything like that. Just paint this all over those areas. What I then do is grab some Druchii Violet and I just add this into the deepest sort of recessed areas, anywhere that's deep in shadow or anywhere that you want to look a bit bruised, just to add a little bit of colour, tonal changes, just to make it look a little bit bruised, a little bit more filth. Once all that's dried, we just go back in with a little bit of Kislev flesh and then a little bit of Flayed one flesh. Just do some simple layering, picking out those raised areas on the intestines, any raised areas on any of the other skin that's on the weapons. Some of it's on the weapons. There's a little bit on the mace, the spiky mace the guy's got. Just pick out any raised areas. Now, the actual paint here on the intestines was still a little bit wet. The Volupus pink and Druchii Violet was ever so slightly wet. Don't worry about that. What it does is when you're actually painting the highlights, you pick a little bit of that colour up, and it helps just give helps with the blending. Doesn't have to be, but sometimes the paint being wet underneath, you actually do a little bit of wet blending. It just picks up some of that base colour and helps with your blending, because it turns it that subtlish reddish purpley pink colour. Okay, and there's the skin done. Now we're going to be moving on to the third guy, and this is where we're going to be using the airbrush. You could do this with the slap chop effect if you wanted to, but for this I'm using the airbrush. So the model is base coated in Tenebrous Grey, like I said before, and then I've gone over that with AK Beast Brown, which is Mournfang Brown in the Citadel range, all over the model. We're then using the airbrush and some Vallejo White Ink, and we're doing the good old zenithal type highlight, where with the white ink I'm picking out the areas that I want to be the brightest, or showing as really bright green, and then leaving areas gradiented to the brownish colour where I want to be deep in shadows. So I'm almost, as you can see, pointing the airbrush down, directly down sometimes, or straight on to where I know I want it to be bright, and you just let the natural haloing effect from the airbrush create gradients from the bright white to that dark reddish brown. As this is a tabletop and not a sort of a a competition type model, the lighting effects doesn't necessarily have to be bang on realism. As I want the model to stand out, I am pointing the airbrush up sometimes to pick out some of that detail on the arms and gloves underneath, just to pick out some of those shapes. If you're doing a competition piece, obviously you would only pick out the areas that you want to be bright and have the gradients working and the bounce reflections. But for this, you know, for me the sunlight is coming like directly over this shoulder here, so that line of white there is where it would be quite bright, focusing on areas where you want to be brighter. The camera, obviously, it kind of sometimes whites out, but you can even see there where I've got bright white to dark white to brown, getting those subtle tonal differences. That's straight through the airbrush. That's a cheap Fengda £30 airbrush from Amazon. It's not a very expensive one. I tend not to use expensive airbrushes for the work that I do. I think we get some fantastic effects with some quite cheap airbrushes. Plus, if you have any problems with it or it breaks, these usually last me about a year, so I have to get a new one each year. But I'd rather do that than have the cost, you know, £250 or even £150 for a nice airbrush. I've generally had a few problems with them. They can be quite finicky to use, and for what I do a lot of airbrushing, a lot of colours go through it, a lot of cleaning, a lot of abuse. So I don't really mind if a £30 one breaks. So yeah, just work around with the airbrush. If as soon as it gets very bright and wet, move to the next area. If you stay on that area, the paint will pool and spiderweb and run and look terrible. But again, the airbrush is a hobby, and a hobby takes a bit of practice, so I would always recommend, if you get one, grab yourself a vehicle kit, cheap off eBay, like I say, a Rhino or a Predator, any cheap vehicle that you can get to practice on, or large bits of plastic like basing to practice your airbrush skills on. I may do some videos on it. I'm not the professional of airbrushing, I just know how to get some effects out of it. So here we're moving on now. Once that's all dried, we're now going to use the Citadel Contrast Mantis Warrior Green to get that nice yellowish green, bright, Nurgle armour that I was asked. This one was someone contacted me to do this, where they wanted to have nice green, very bright green, based off a little bit of how I did my Nurgle Marines for 40k, nice bright green, but without having to do lots of layering with the brush, so all through the airbrush. So as you can see, I'm just working around, just covering all of it now with the green. Again, if it starts to shine, then just move away, because that area is very wet. The contrast comes out fantastically through the airbrush. They're really good. So just work yourself around and cover all the armour in the Mantis green. If you wanted a slightly more green, you could use the Striking Scorpion green. They're very much similar, I would say, in their effect, in how they look through the airbrush. But the Striking Scorpion is a bit more green. So what I put on my salamanders. This Nurgle, this green, this Mantis Warrior, has got a bit more yellow to it, a bit more washed out, but still quite intense. And just to protect it, and also we're going to be doing a lot of washes over the top, or a few washes over the top, and this is mostly for protection. I airbrush on some ultra matte varnish from AK. You could just use normal matte varnish or hard coat, but this is the matte varnish, so it tones it all down. I prefer matte varnish to a gloss varnish, especially on miniatures. It just flattens the model out, protects it, and just gives a nicer effect for armour. So the next stage we're going to be doing edge highlighting and battle damage. So for this I am using a fantastically named paint, which is AK Frog Green. This would be Moot Green in the Citadel range. A little bit of water to thin it down, a few drops of paint, one drop of water. Very simple. Edge highlighting at first, just going around picking out all those edges, and then I'm also going to be adding some scratches, some dents, some pot marks that we're going to be backfilling with Tenebrous Grey in a little bit. So this is just your opportunity to add some battle damage, wear and tear, and edge highlight the model. The reason I do a lot of battle damage like this is I've got a slightly shaky right hand, so to do a clean edge is quite tricky sometimes for me, so I have to add it into battle damage is a lot better. So where you're adding damage, little star shapes, slightly thicker lines, just remember that we're going to be going back in and colouring in the middle of those areas with a darker colour. Now I've got many tutorials on battle damage. I don't hide anything here. This is all this one's got a little bit longer, this model, because there's a lot of edge highlighting to do, and the battle damage takes a bit of time, so you can just follow along to see how I do it. But some of the vehicle tutorials that I've got really goes in depth of how it can work and some of the effects you can get with it. So once you're done, any areas that, as you can see, that I've also gone back through and just base coated all of the armour bits, the stuff that wasn't armour in the Tenebrous Grey. Just where you've got your pot marks and your holes and all of that kind of stuff and your thicker lines, just use that Tenebrous Grey now, just to colour those in, that it's gone down to that base metal colour. You could use a darkish reddish brown, you could do like Rhinox Hide or Beast Brown or Grim Brown from AK, but I go Tenebrous Grey because it's nice and dark, but say any dark reddish browns you could do as well, as if it was pitted and rusted underneath. So next stage is some non-metallic metal. If you don't want to do this, you would just paint your metals how you normally would and work it through that way. But I was requested to do some non-metallic metal. So the non-metallic metal, sort of brass, we start off with AK Whole Red. So base coat all of your anything you want to be sort of gold and brassy colour with AK Whole Red. So now we're adding our first sort of highlight, and that's with AK Medium Rust. So for this, it's where you start adding where you want your bright points of your non-metallics to be. So obviously the top edges, any rivets you can pick out. Definitely all your edge highlighting you want to do with the medium rust. Just adding in, so for me, as I said, the sunlight is coming in from his left hand, top left hand. So I'm imagining there's would be some bright points at the bottom corners of areas where they've been shadow being covered here. This is your chance to get a little bit clever with where you put your highlights. Less is more, what I'm doing here. I'm only adding subtle highlights here, leaving a lot of it in the original colours, especially when we do a little wash over it in a little bit, just to help with some of the blending. But this medium rust colour, make sure you do all the edge highlights with this, and this is where you start to add. I'm probably covering about 30-40% of the area with the medium rust, but making sure I do the edge highlights as well. So our first real highlight colour now is with AK Pastel Peach. So this is where I do a bit more edge highlighting and do some scratchy dent pot marks, picking out some of the rivets, any areas that you want to be bright, pick out with the Pastel Peach. Add a little bit of water. It's quite an intense colour, quite a tonal jump from the medium rust. You can see I've not done any blending here. I've not done any mixes. I'm just going from one colour to the next. Because for Nurgle, it's you can do that with these models because they're so dented and filth ridden. You could do some mixes of these 50-50 in between each one, but I just wanted to get them straight out. So yeah, water down the pastel peach a little bit because it's quite an intense colour, and all you're doing here is where your medium rust was, you're just painting inside of that to add some of your initial highlight. notice here, and on some of these flatter areas, I'm almost dry brushing, scratching that paint on because it's so heavily worn. There's so much sculpted onto these models that you can dry brush lines and scratch and scrapes. As I said, these like Maggotkin type models are really good for learning non-metallic metal because it's forgiving, because there's lots of dents and scratches and pot marks all over it, but you can see that the highlight is actually relatively small in comparison to the areas we're painting, but it gives a really good effect. And then finally I use a little bit of the ice yellow, very small, just to add a couple of dot highlights, a few lines here and there of where I want to be extremely bright. I actually forget a step at the end here, is where the medium rust, you make it into a glaze or a wash, so you know, one little brush of paint to about 2, 3, 4 drops of water, so you make a wash out of it, and then just wash over all of the areas you've just done. It helps tone down some of the brightness and just acts as a sort of blending agent between all the different colours that we did. I'll do it in a little bit, you'll see me do it. You should really do it once you've finished here, that you've done your ice yellow highlights. Just add a little bit of that medium rust as a sort of wash over all of your metallic areas. Next up is the leather, and what I do is anything that's leather on the models, so there's a little bit of sort of a leather cloaky robe things, any of the handles of the weapons, anything you want to be leather, I base coat with grim brown. I then do some layering, so then I use AK leather brown as my first layer, covering probably 90%, just leaving the grim brown in the darkest recesses. I then use AK saddle brown as my first highlight, which is an edge highlight and picking out all the raised areas and wear and tear. And then a final highlight with a sort of fleshy tone. For this I'm going to be using the Flayed one flesh, but any sort of bright fleshy tone you can use. Even Cadian flesh tone is quite good for a reddish type finish. And that's an edge highlight, and also just picking out any of the damaged areas. Anywhere where you want heavy wear and tear, use your brightest colour just to pick it out. So now we're going to be doing some more non-metallic metal, but we're going to be doing this sort of silver, and you just use two colours for this, where we do a little bit of blending. So first off, I'm using AK Dark Sea Blue, very, very dark greenish blue. So just base coat anything you want to be silver in this colour. And then to get brighter and brighter, all we're doing is adding more white into the mix. It's as simple as that. So first off, it starts off as pretty much a 70-30 mix, blue to white, and then a 50-50, and then you start moving into more white until you reach almost pure white. So for that sort of area there that I was just doing on the sort of shaft of his weapon, you could just see I just picked out the top edge. I left the rest of it in Tenebrous Grey because that's all in the deepest shadows. So you can see there I've got a little bit of the paint, and here this is almost a 50-50 mix because we don't need to do too much. And then for the chainmail, it's almost a dry brushing over the areas that you want to be bright, just picking out the areas that you want to be brightest. And on the part of his weapon there, I just pick out the top edge, dots, scratches and lines, just to show it's heavily worn. We're showing this that it is metallic, not that it is heavily metallic. Very simple to do this method. It works really well. I find silver harder to do than gold, but a little bit of practice, and as you can see here, add a little bit more white into the mix. So this is our sort of main first highlight. Pick out little bits here and there where you want to be brighter, and then a few lines. Now, I wouldn't mix your metallics and non-metallics. If you've done the gold or brass in non-metallic, then you're best to do your silvers in non-metallics. If you mix the two, it looks really weird. There's not much silver on these. There's a little bit on the top of the spiky mace, which you'll see. What I do is I actually do a lot of blending. I add in the dark sea blue and then just do a lot of wet blending on the top of that mace, because I cover it in some of the Volupus pink a bit later, because it's like a face skin type thing coming off of the top of that. Okay, next up we're going to be painting sort of wood areas. So I say they were base coated with the grim brown. I'm then going to pick out almost dry brushing, a little bit of layering with AK leather brown to pick out the starting of the highlights of the tree. There's a load of sculpted detail on this tree, so it's not too hard to pick out the sort of flatter raised areas and the edges with the leather brown. You can also use this as there's some horns that come out a couple of the other guys, so anything that you want to be wooded or horned, you can use these colours to achieve that. So yeah, base coated with the green brown, and then your first highlight is with leather brown. What I do is I like to use a lot of the sort of same colours on the models, so I'm not using hundreds of colours. So what I actually do now is I make a mix using the leather brown, and I actually mix in a little bit of Flayed one flesh to it, almost a 50-50 mix. And you can see that I've got an oldish type brush, and I'm just dry brushing that over the bark areas. And if you want to go brighter, then do a little bit more of a mix with the add a little bit more Flayed one flesh to it, and you get these nice fleshy brownish tones that interact with the model really well, because we've used these colours across the model, and they give a more natural feel to the areas where you're doing the blending of colours that you've already used before across the whole model. So just pick out some of the details with your brighter colours. I don't go too bright on this, I didn't want it to stand out. I actually wanted the sort of brassy areas to be some of the bright points, and the little bit of skin and that around by his belly where it's broken through. That's what I wanted to be bright on this model. Okay, so even though we've covered off this in separate ways, I wanted to show you what I did here. So as you can see, that I've painted the sort of flesh part coming from his mace in the Kislev flesh as we did before. Now I've got that dark sea blue. I'm quite heavily painting it on, filling in sort of surrounding areas and moving into that flesh area a bit more. And then those mixed colours, I just wet blend some of these mixed colours onto it just so it gets brighter in those bright points. It doesn't have to be exactly perfect, I just wanted there to be shown that this is the metal areas. So where you want it to be bright, use your brighter mixes that you did before. As I say, we are going over this with the Volupus pink in a minute, so this doesn't have to be perfect, this part. It's just a quick way of doing the sort of non-metallic metal, and then some blending a bit later. But you can see there where the paint is still wet, it's all blending in quite nicely. So once it's dry here, you can see I'm grabbing that Volupus pink and I'm painting all of the flesh areas in the Volupus pink, and that'll be including the flesh area that's coming out from the mace and wrapped around his hand. I also go over, you'll notice that I add some to the mace and then wash my brush out, and with a little bit of water just wet blend from the dark Volupus pink out towards the edges of that mace, just so the Volupus pink's a little bit brighter towards, sorry, a little bit lessened towards the edges. And whilst that's drying, just to quickly paint the eyes, I infill the eyes with just some white, and then grab some Green Stuff World Fluorescent Red and just paint that over the white. Very simple to do, as you can see there, 3 dots of white around the sockets of the eyes. And then with that fluorescent red from Green Stuff World, heavily shake the bottle, let the ball bearing rattle around, and then just plop a dot of this inside, and you'll get a nice reddish glow eye socket. So the camera here is really struggling to pick it out because it's really bright, but yeah, it's almost like adding a contrast paint, so quite a big drop of paint on the brush just to add those in. And anywhere else there's a couple of eyes dotted around some of the weaponry, you can just add a few dots of that on, and there we go. That's quite a lot of the model done here. What I'm doing now is with the Tenebrous Grey is I'm just adding in some recess shading, just to define some shapes. I noticed some of the shapes had disappeared a little bit around some of the gold areas, so with some thinned down Tenebrous Grey, probably 1 drop of paint, 2 or 3 drops of water, just so you create a sort of thickish wash. You could just use Nuln Oil if you wanted to do, or any black wash, but just that Tenebrous Grey is our dark colour that we've been using. I just go around any of the recesses and just paint this into those areas. It takes a little bit of a steady hand. If you're not sure to do this, just practice. Don't worry if you make a mistake. You can add it as a little bit of battle damage. Don't worry, there's always ways around it. But just add little bits of this in any of the deepest recesses, just to pick out some of those shapes and definitions. Just to add this does do quite a lot. It doesn't look it at first, but it does add some to the eye. It helps you be able to pick out some of those shapes and define those edges. So where you've got a bright edge highlight, having the recess very, very dark adds that contrast that you see, and then enables you to pick out the shapes. And there we have it. So that's Blight Templars cooked in 3 ways. Obviously extremely filthy, not so filthy, and a little bit cleaner, with heavily rusted, nice metallic finishing, and a non-metallic effect at the end via the airbrush. So hopefully that's been of some use to you. Hopefully you can use some of those techniques on your Blight Templars or your Maggotkin or your 40k Nurgle guys, any Nurgly dudes. Loads of images on this one now to show you some of how they look. So yeah, I hope you've enjoyed it. As always, like, comment, subscribe, get in contact, do all that social media stuff. I'm on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, the TikToks. Just get in contact. Your support is greatly appreciated. At this point, I'm nearly at over 400 subscribers. Hopefully this year we can grow even more and do even more tutorials. So yeah, good luck and happy painting, my fellow painters.